Well, we're back in Acts chapter 6, verse 1, the identification of the Grecians, and after looking at some of the views that I just really don't think make any sense, they almost create more problems than they solve, I'd like to come to what I feel is the correct interpretation of identifying who these Grecians are. And I'd like to do it under 3 points here. Number one, some of this will be somewhat of review, but I want to include part of some of the other interpretations that we've discussed earlier that are correct, but they just didn't say enough or go far enough. Surely it is true that the two groups, the Grecians and the Hebrews, spoke different languages. That was the old traditional view that's basically the distinction between Grecians and Hebrews is a language difference. Surely the Grecians spoke Greek, and the Hebrews spoke some Semitic tongue, either Hebrew or Aramaic. So we would agree with that part of the traditional interpretation, that there is a distinction between these two groups on the basis of language. However, that's not the ultimate one, and it's really not even the basic one. Because what I've just given you, the fact that the Grecians surely spoke Greek and the Hebrew spoke Aramaic or Hebrew, does not, however, preclude the fact that one or the other of these groups could not also speak some other languages, or at least one other language. For instance, the Grecians, surely some of them also spoke, in addition to Greek, Aramaic and or Hebrew. I mean, Paul is a good example. He calls himself a Hebrew, and in one regard he could be considered that. He could also be considered a Grecian because he's diaspora born and Greek speaking. But Paul also spoke Hebrew, and Paul also spoke Aramaic. So saying that the Grecians spoke Greek and that's all is not enough. And then what about the so-called Hebrews here? Well, assuming, and this seems to be the case, that they spoke Aramaic, that was the natural language that they spoke, evidently these Hebrews could also speak Greek, most of them could anyway, and perhaps some of them could speak Hebrew as well. In other words, we've not only got bilinguals, but trilinguals here in both groups, and probably more than that. Paul surely spoke Latin as well. And he could be, although he's of course not on the scene, I don't mean to imply he's on the scene, but something like him could be taking place. We could have a person similar to him. So language is true here. It's not the chief point of distinction. It's a contributing factor. I looked up to see what some other translations had to give here. Let me just mention three that would fit here under this first point. The New English Bible translates it as follows. Those who spoke Greek, see, they fall into the linguistic trap here, saying that is the distinction. Doesn't even give us Grecians. KJV is much better in giving us Grecians because at least you give us a mystery term that has to be interpreted. Those who spoke Greek and those who spoke the language of the Jews. Now notice they're not willing to commit themselves to whether that language was Hebrew or Aramaic. They'll be safe and say the language of the Jews. It was probably Aramaic. And they give a footnote that gives LIT period. That means literally Hellenists and Hebrews. Then the Berkeley Bible gives, what do I have here? The Greek-speaking Jews and those who spoke Hebrew. They commit themselves to which Semitic tongue of the two was spoken by the Hebrews. Again, it's a total linguistic distinction. Greek-speaking Jews, Hebrew-speaking Jews. The New American Bible, those who spoke Greek and those who spoke Hebrew. And it gives a footnote and calls the Greek speakers Hellenistic Jews from the diaspora. So you also gave us geography there, diaspora, but you gave us something pretty good in a footnote when you called them Hellenistic Jews. Now you've gone beyond. That term Hellenism is a broad term. You've gone beyond just identifying them on the basis of language. Now remember that the word Hellenistai, which is the term we're looking at which is behind Acts 6 and verse 1, actually has little to do with language. You could have chosen another term for language. It really means one who acts or causes another to act like a Greek. Basically, it's what the term means. So language distinction is not enough. And then also, you might want to have your attention called to the very important 9th verse The presence of different synagogues, all of them in Jerusalem, implies the use of different languages in them. We'll probably study this verse a little, well, I know we will, a little more thoroughly later on. It's a little confusing. We won't pass judgment on it now as to how many synagogues are being referred to. But certainly different nationalities of people, and yet they're Jewish people, though, because this is all in Jerusalem. Then there arose certain of the synagogue, which is called the synagogue of the Libertines and Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and of them of Cilicia, that sounds like Paul's background there, and of Asia. Now let's drop that first, the Libertines, and because that probably means something else. And look at these national backgrounds here. The Cyrenians, well, that's in North Africa. Alexandrians, that's in Egypt. Cilicia, you know essentially where that is, not far from Antioch of Syria. And Asia, which is over to the west of Asia Minor. Now you've got synagogues representing these various Jewish groups that have come from diaspora to settle in Jerusalem. Surely you've got various languages being spoken here. Okay, a second point. Surely it's also true that for the most part, the groups represent different geography. That was an extension of the traditional view. Not only do we have a language difference, but a geographical one. The Grecians are from the diaspora, and the Hebrews are from Palestine. Again, I think the synagogues of verse 9 point to this because they are named after different places. And so here are a couple of translations that will combine the linguistic distinction with the geographic. Goodspeed, Greek-speaking Jews, he stays with language difference there, and native Jews. Well, now you've gone to a geographical identification. Williams' translation, Greek-speaking Jews and native Hebrews. Well, again, you gave us on the first hand a language difference, and on the second hand a difference of location or geography. And over in chapter 9 and verse 29, both of them, Goodspeed and Williams, give simply Greek-speaking. Remember, we're going to find Grecian again over there. There's textual variant over in chapter 11, but in 929 we'll find Grecian in the KJV again. The same term, Hellenistai, is behind it in the Greek. Then the third point we come to tonight would be summing up more of what the correct view is here. Surely Luke is after more than just language and place of birth. It would have taken, I think, more for such a serious problem to arise that almost split the early church here than just a difference of language and place of birth. I mean, that is true, but doesn't that tell us something else? Isn't something else implied in that? So the background appears to be something like this. From the rabbinical writings, we know that groups such as the Pharisees, the good old legalists and nationalists at heart, looked with suspicious disdain on diaspora-born Greek-speaking Jews. And some of the New Testament episodes also evidently point in this direction, not so much concerning just the Pharisees, but concerning native-born Aramaic-speaking Jews. In other words, what I'm saying here is that there does appear to be a suspicious thread, or a thread of suspicion, that runs throughout book of Acts as well as the life of the Apostle Paul, where Jews who speak Aramaic and who are native-born, born in Israel, are suspicious of those outside. I mean, surely you remember the fact that Paul often has to vehemently defend his Jewishness or his Hebrew heritage. Why would he have to do something like that? Well, surely that's due to the fact he was born in Tarsia and he spoke the Greek language, as we read over in Acts 21, verses 37 through 39. And why would that present a problem? Just because he was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, a foreign Gentile province, part of the Roman Empire, but outside of Israel, and that his native tongue was Greek, he was born in a Greek land, and he spoke Greek. Well, if what I've said thus far is correct, anyone who wanted to oppose Paul, really who wanted to oppose Paul's message, could simply point to what they would call his second-class citizenship. Well, no wonder Paul has such unorthodox views about trying to get this Messiah business out of the Old Testament. Well, he was born way up there in Tarsus of Cilicia. No wonder he's wrong about his interpretation. Let me just mention a few verses here, and we're only going to look at a few of these, where if you read carefully enough, you can see that there's some suspicious thread that's running in the background of a lot of Paul's epistles. And we can see some of it in Acts, but especially in some of Paul's epistles. He is having to defend his Jewishness. Well, he's obviously a Jew. That's obvious. I mean, he was trained by Gamaliel right in Jerusalem. So why would you have to defend something that's obvious? But you see your place of birth, though. The fact that you natively speak Greek and not Aramaic or Hebrew. You might have learned that as you were growing up, but Greek was the language of the land in which you were born. If you read carefully, you see that there's some problem, and Paul is having to defend this, that I am a Hebrew, I am a Jew. For instance, Acts 22. Now, we're not going to look at all of these now. You can on your own if you desire. Verses 1 to 3. Acts 23 and verse 6. Acts 24, verses 10 through 17. Acts 26, verses 4 and 5. And a couple I've already mentioned before. Philippians 3, verse 5. Listen to this. If any man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more, circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law of Pharisee. Why have to go over that? Why have to go over your past resume as a Jew? But he's telling us that although I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, I was circumcised on the 8th day after my birth, even in a Gentile foreign land dominated by Gentiles up there. I followed the Old Testament prescription. And in the concluding chapters of 2 Corinthians, which all Bible students recognize actually forms an entire separate section in Corinthians, so much so that the critical scholars think that this is part of one of those lost books of Corinthians that we discussed way earlier in biblical literature. There are 2 lost Corinthians. Really, we should have 4. Well, I don't mean we should have 4. I mean, there's a possibility of having 4. We only have 2. 1 and 2 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. But chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. I mean, he really changes the tone of his voice when you open up chapter 10 and verse 1, 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. And you can tell it's a rather extended defense, apology, polemic against, well, that's kind of difficult to identify. Just who is it against? False apostles, or is it against what some people call the super apostles? That may be closer to the mark here. There may be more than one group of false leaders spreading various malicious lies and slander about the Apostle Paul. Now, he liked the church at Corinth. He had founded them. He took the trouble of visiting them 3 times and writing to them at least 4 times, but sometimes that love is lost, I think, on them. He hardly gets out of there, and the ink is dried on the last period to one of his epistles, and here come the super apostles behind, and they must be saying something about Paul. Somehow they're calling something about Paul into question. One thing I think we can gather from chapter 10, as well as chapters 1 and 2 of 1 Corinthians, is Paul's lack of eloquence as he spoke. Remember, he said, I didn't come with the excellence of speech and wisdom. And we're told here in verse 10 of chapter 10 that some people say, see, he's quoting, you can tell he's a lot of times either quoting what the Corinthians are saying or quoting what some of these wolves in sheep's clothing are saying. For they say his letters are weighty and powerful. And we know that that's true. But, it's easy to write threats from a distance. See, that's their argument. Wow, anybody could do that. But his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible. Remember, we're talking about Corinth. I mean, this is in Greece where you're supposed to be trained to speak well. If you have anything to say, make sure you can say it well, or people won't listen. But Luke has something to say about the Athenians over in Acts 17, where he said they're just a group of people that get together to hear every new thing. If something's new, that's what they like to do, is get together and hear it. And Paul here does have something new to say, but he doesn't have any fancy way to say it. It's just the cross of Christ. A Jewish man crucified on a wooden post. And wow, that's foolishness. Well, that's his whole argument in 1 Corinthians 1. But then if you jump down in chapter 11 to verse 22, again, it's a verse I mentioned earlier. These chapters are just filled with irony, and they're filled with times where he's quoting the Corinthians, or he's quoting a wolf in sheep's clothing. It makes them a little more difficult to interpret. It's not just, straight epistle material or straight letter material here. Really, we could back up a little. I mean, he's talking, we know in verses 13 and 14 and 15 about the false apostles, the ministers of Satan. And he's always having to say, well, I'm going to boast, but, I'm going to have to boast like a fool, and let no man think me a fool, if otherwise yet as a fool. Verse 16, receive me, that I may boast myself a little. Verse 19, for ye suffer fools gladly, seeing ye yourselves are wise. Well, there's irony. I mean, they're not wise. He's just proven that in the first epistle to them, 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. For ye suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face. I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Now, you're probably not following all of what these verses mean. It takes, a little interpretation to draw the meaning out of them. But here's a verse we'll get to and end with. Are they Hebrews? All right, some false ministers have come around saying, we're Jews, we're Jews, we're Jews. Well, Paul was a Jew, but you see, Paul wasn't born in Israel, though. Paul isn't a native Jew. By virtue of the fact he keeps having to defend his Jewishness, we know there's some type of suspicion against him. It's a false suspicion, and it's being created by these false religious leaders, but these false religious leaders are native Jews, that's for sure. They are born in Israel, they are from Israel, and they're traveling behind Paul, and they follow him all the way up here into Greece. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Well, you've said the same thing 3 times, really. What's the difference between a Hebrew and an Israelite or a child of Abraham? But he's emphasizing the point. If they say they are, so am I. So, back to my argument here. The pure Hebrews, those born in Israel, are very suspicious then of the Grecians due to their language and their place of birth. But these are just bare facts. What do these two things represent? Language and birth, diaspora born, Greek language as the native tongue. What do they represent? Well, a different way of life, a different outlook. Hellenism. And all of this is so true. It's just what we saw earlier in Hellenism and Hebraism. Now, the diaspora community didn't adopt the lower morals or the false mythology or philosophy of the Greeks, not that type of Hellenism, but aspects of the cultural and intellectual Greek way of life had to rub off on them. This is what you've been wanting to get to, and we discussed earlier, Hebraism versus Hellenism. Do we have an Orthodox community at home and an unorthodox one abroad? Not in the religious sense, but for those people born outside of Israel, born in the diaspora, surely some parts of the cultural and intellectual side of Hellenism had to rub off on them. Now, we're going to see how important that's going to become in Luke's narrative. That's why he's bringing the Grecians in. They're not a bad group in his eyes. They're a very important group. We might call them the spark plug to the early church. The early church, including the apostles, sat down on God. And you'll see what I mean by that here in a moment. If we even get to it tonight, I don't know if I'll have time to get to that. That's a big statement to make already. The apostles themselves, not people like Paul. Of course, he's not even on the scene yet. That's, by the way, one of the reasons he was brought in. The apostles sat down on God. And that's why he brings in this controversy, because that does take place because God wanted this to happen in Acts chapter 6, because it's going to bring in a new group of people with a different outlook. Jewish people, Christian people, but people with an extended type outlook. for God to get the message out into the world and for God to do what he wants to have done. Now remember, we're not talking just about Jews here in Acts 6. We're talking about Christians. People then might ask, well, surely they would have lost their prejudices, these Grecians and Hebrews, the Hebrews in particular. They would have lost their prejudices in Christ. Well, not necessarily. I mean, it could have rather easily been carried over in some unconscious way. That these native-born Hebrews turned Christians are a little suspicious of these diaspora-born, Greek-speaking Jewish people turned Christians who have become a part of the church in Jerusalem. As the church grows and the needy become so numerous, somebody's going to be left out. And since we're in Israel, we're in Jerusalem, it's the Jewish Hebrew Christian church here. If someone is going to be left out, someone's bound to be left out, well, I would guess that it would be easy for the Hellenistic Jewish Christian widows to be the ones neglected. And see, that's exactly what we're told here in Acts 6 and verse 1. We've kind of just gone about it maybe a roundabout way or through the back door, but we haven't really given you any information that you need beyond what you already have here in the Word in Acts 6:1. In those days, when the number of disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews because their widows, the Grecian widows, the Hellenistic Jewish Christian widows, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. So what we have here is more of an intellectual, cultural difference between these two groups of people. Still part of the early church. Both groups are full-fledged believers. We're not talking about nominal Christians or something here. Luke doesn't leave that implication with us at all. We've got full-fledged Christians, but, I mean, let's be realistic. You can bring your national, racial, geographical prejudices with you right over into Christianity. You have to be purged of those. That's the problem that we have right here. These Hebrew Christians have brought their biases with them, a national bias. Well, yes, we're all Christians and we're all one in Christ, that's true, but we were born in Israel, though. We were born in Israel. This is the promised land. I mean, if you Hellenistic Jews were so orthodox, and we don't have a problem with religious orthodoxy, we haven't had a shred of evidence of that earlier. But if you Jews out there, after all, were so orthodox, why didn't you move to Palestine earlier? Why did you have to wait until you're almost dead, old age, to die and be buried here? Why didn't you move back to the promised land? See, we can understand what the current is underground between these two groups of people. Full-fledged believers, but one group has some geographical national prejudices to bring with them. Not so much racial, because they're all Jews, but a geographical bias. We were born in Israel. So how should we translate it? Well, I don't have any problem with the way we've got it in the KJV. Hebrews is certainly good. Hebrews. Grecians, you could improve on that by just giving us a literal transliteration and call them Hellenists. Because when you leave it as Grecian, it could carry the connotation, if you didn't know otherwise, that we're talking about Greeks or Gentiles here. We're not. We're talking about Jewish people, people who are full-blooded Jews. But then Grecian is an unusual term, Grecian. If he means Greek, then it's translated Greek in other places, or Gentile in the New Testament. Only on these occasions, Acts 6, 9, and 11, will you find the term Grecian. So as long as we understand what's meant by the term, you can just leave it as Grecian. That's what I've chosen to do. But a literal translation or transliteration would simply be the Hellenists and the Hebrews. Now, the only translation that I could find which tried to bring this nuance into the text was Wiest. And he doesn't do it on 6:1. He does it on 9:29. And here's how he translates Hellenistai. Wiest, Kenneth Wiest in 9:29. Jews, because we are talking about Jewish people, Jews who had adopted Greek culture. See, what you've done is you just kind of fleshed out the term Hellenist. You fleshed it out. You let us know we're not talking about, Babylonians that were influenced by the Greek way of life and thought, but Jewish people. And Jewish people who, it doesn't matter what they spoke or where they were born, Jewish people who had adopted the Greek culture. And I think that's a good fleshing out, although you've added extra words in there that goes more into interpretation rather than translation. Now, let's come to maybe the significance of what we have here on our hands then. Now that we understand what we have, we understand some of the suspicious thoughts that seem to be running somewhat beneath the surface, but however in the background, then what actually is the significance? Well, let me ask this question. What are some of the reasons for the Hellenistic widow's difficulty in obtaining proper food? I think we'll have to start with this. The Grecians murmur because they're neglected, that is, their widows are neglected. Nothing is said, by the way, about any widows among the Hebrews or any widows being neglected among the Hebrews. Luke is silent on that matter. Surely they're not being neglected. Probably they exist, but they're not being neglected. The Grecians are the ones murmuring because they are the ones, their widows anyway, being neglected. So what are some of the reasons? Well, number one, the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, the Jewish leaders, the temple in Jerusalem had relief supplies for the needy. That was part of Old Testament law. They had relief supplies for the needy. But they would have been rather hesitant in allowing Jewish Christians to benefit from it, though, especially Hellenistic ones. See, the temple had, a needy fund, as it were. And so if a Jew had need of the fund, then they could apply for the money. But if you're a Jewish Christian, I don't think you're going to get very far in applying for the money. And if you are a Jewish Christian and you were born in Greece or in Asia Minor, you're surely not going to get the money. And besides, I don't think the Christians would ever have really wanted their help, Jewish officialdom's help, lest their neglect of their own cast a reflection on this new movement of theirs. You have to take care of your own. A second reason for them having difficulty in obtaining proper food was the fact that inasmuch as they came from the diaspora, they probably had left much of their family behind. So they'd have little family support. You can't depend on Jewish relief supply or the needy fund. You don't even have family support. You're a widow, remember. And then, as I think I mentioned earlier, thirdly, why widows? Well, a family was only likely to return permanently once their children were grown and they were older. And that's because they wanted to, either A, be in the land of Israel whenever Messiah returned, or B, be in the land of Israel when you died so you could be buried in promised soil. But if a family moves back and the children are grown, what happens if the husband dies first? Well, it'd be very hard for the wife or the woman to go out and land a job. And Luke kind of clues us into the fact that some time has taken place since the early days of Pentecost with these initial phrases in Acts 6:1, and in those days, and with this qualifier, when the number of the disciples was multiplied. He notes that time has elapsed. He notes that too many needy ones are present. So the most obvious group to neglect would be the Hellenistic widows. And so let's get right into what Luke might be attempting to tell us by introducing the food situation here. So this will be the most important section that we've discussed thus far concerning the problem of the ID of these people in Acts 6:1. What I'm about to say will be the most important material that I'm going to discuss with you because it really helps us interpret Acts and the narrative here a lot better. What I feel is that Luke wanted to introduce to us a very exciting segment of early Christianity, notably these Hellenists. And much of the next few chapters, including really kind of the theme of the rest of the book, builds on the fact of these Hellenists being introduced here. Now, if all that we've said is true thus far, that there does seem to be a little bit of a problem between the Jews and the Hellenists, and the Hebrews and the Grecians, KJV, and it is due to the fact that there is a suspicious thought running in the background. There will be neglected. Then it only stands to reason, in my mind anyway, that the 7 men selected in verse 5, whom we of course know to be selected to deal with the problem that this group has encountered, would probably be from that group. If they are selected to represent the group or to deal with the problems of the group, in other words, in supplying the needs of these widows that are being neglected at this time, it only stands to reason that these 7 men are selected from that group. In order to be a proper representative, you've got to have something, at stake in the matter. And if you're if you're a Jerusalem-born Jew, well, you're going to bring your prejudices, your biases right into the whole situation with you.
For the continuation of this message,
if you're a Jerusalem-born Jew, well, you're going to bring your prejudices, your biases right into the whole situation with you. All 7 of the men have Greek names. Could be a coincidence. I doubt that. It doesn't prove anything conclusively on its own, because such names are being used by Hebraic Jews as well. Jews being born in Israel being given Greek names. But it just so happens that all 7 are given Greek names. Now, that doesn't prove anything conclusively about them, but I think that it's obvious enough whenever we gather the other information in chapters 7 and 8 and 9 and 11 together, that Luke is telling us that these are 7 men with 7 Greek names. They are part of the Grecian or Hellenist group, which means that in fact they come from a Gentile background, that is, Gentile by location. Only one is a Gentile by blood, and he's called a proselyte, and that's Nicholas. And notice he is from, of all places, Antioch, and I don't think that is by coincidence either. And yet no sooner are they chosen to wait on tables, that's the end of verse 2, the apostle said it's not reason that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. So this concerned the distribution, passing out of food. Just an old mundane matter of passing out food. No sooner are they chosen to wait on tables, and we see Stephen out preaching. Now, you probably heard a lot of sermons about this matter. I think a lot of charismatics use it for what they call ministerial graduation. I know I've heard it used like that often. Well, now here Stephen is, and he was faithful in what God called him to do, and so bless God, God moves him up in the ministry and takes him from waiting on tables to being an evangelist and a divine miracle worker and a divine healer and everything, as you see in verse 8. Stephen, full of faith and power, did great wonders and miracles among the people. Well, that's interesting in itself, that a man chosen to wait on tables is working some miracles in the midst of the people. That probably means that he's performing a few miracles in the midst of not only the Hellenistic people, his own group, but we've got truly one church here. It's not 2 churches, 2 groups in a church, but one church in Jerusalem. He's doing some miracles before these Jewish people as well. Where is he doing some of these miracles? Well, what about verse 9, since that's right in the immediate context here? I mean, Stephen, that's not a Jewish name. That's a Greek Gentile name. He's from one of these places. We're not told where he's from, but he's not from Israel. He is one of these people. By the way, he's not an older person, too. I haven't said earlier that all of the Hellenistic people have to be older people, the people that have moved from diaspora back to Palestine. And by the way, a lot of time has elapsed. So you've got time for birth, and we don't know how many years after that. But you've got young people who've come back as well. I didn't mean that to be exclusively reserved for the elderly. We don't know where Stephen's from, but he's not from Israel. He's probably from some place that's related to the synagogue or the synagogues mentioned in verse 9. Synagogue of resettled diaspora-born Jews or their descendants. And what do you think he's preaching? Well, I think that we can construe what he's preaching by looking at the charges leveled against him in verse 13. Something that is slightly misconstrued by his opponents to be against the temple and against the law. Something to be construed that's against the temple and against the law. Maybe we're not all familiar enough with this section that I need to read a little bit of this for us. We've got Stephen chosen. He'll become important first of all, and then Philip is the second man, and he'll become important in chapter 8. This is all in verse 5. And the other 5, whom they set before the apostles, and when they had prayed, they laid their hands on them. And the word of God increased, and the number of the disciples multiplied in Jerusalem greatly, and a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. And Stephen, full of faith and power, did great wonders and miracles among the people. Now, this probably isn't an appropriate place for a paragraph mark like that, because this is all connected. Then there arose certain of the synagogue, which we've already read, disputing. Now look at this. We didn't get to the end of this section, or the end of this verse, disputing with Stephen. And they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spake. Keep in mind the fact that we've got an argument in the background that these native-born Jews are opposed to these Hellenistic Jewish Christians. And yet look who God is choosing to use here in this case. And if you're getting ahead of me in your thinking, and who does he continue to use throughout the rest of the book? He kind of leaves the Jerusalem church behind. As a matter of fact, Paul has to run out in the Gentile world out there, Jewish Gentile world, and collect offerings for all the poor people back in Jerusalem. Don't make more out of it than we know right now. But I said earlier, and I won't take this back, that the apostles are sitting down on God. I think we can prove that here. I mean, he had the apostles. God, why didn't he use them here? They could have been used to do all these things. Why use Stephen? They were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spake. Then they suborned men which said, in other words, false witnesses here, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. That's kind of a general summary. We'll see what the two charges are here in a moment. They stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes who would, think about it, already have a natural bias against this man Stephen, even if he weren't a Christian, because he's a Hellenistic Jew, and came upon him and called him and brought him to the council, and set up false witnesses, which said, this man ceaseth not to speak blasphemous words. Here's the twofold charge, and you really have to get verse 13 or you miss all of his sermon in chapter 7. Whatever the charge is, he's going to defend himself on the basis of the accusation. Against this holy place, all right, that's the temple, and against the law of Moses. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy this place and shall change the customs which Moses delivered us. And all that sat in the council, looking steadfastly on him, saw his face as it had been the face of an angel. Now, it's rather remarkable, and it's because of their ire and anger over this man that they would allow a Hellenistic Jew, a Hellenistic Jewish Christian, to address the Sanhedrin. But he's got Jewish blood. He's got full Jewish blood, so surely they'll let him in. They wouldn't let a Gentile in to do that, but they would let a full Jewish man, as Stephen no doubt is. Verse 1 of the next chapter, poor chapter break, really should have all of this together. Then said the high priest, are these things so? He's already got his mind made up against it anyway, but I guess you're supposed to appear courteous and diplomatic. Are these things so? Have you spoken blasphemous words against the temple and the law? And he said, men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. And we've got the so-called God of Glory sermon here. That's how he starts it off. Some people call it the God of Glory sermon. The God of Glory appeared unto our father Abraham. And you know what he gives, basically, is a review of Old Testament history here. And he adds in some interesting interpretation of Old Testament history. And what becomes important is when you jump over later in the chapter. This chapter can be broken down very brilliantly, so you can see a highly organized and complex message that he has put together here, all by the power of the Spirit. We saw that in chapter 6. They couldn't resist the wisdom of the Spirit by which he spake. And he takes them through a history of Old Testament times, and I can't get into all the points that he's trying to prove, but basically he is responding to this charge concerning blasphemous words against the law and against the temple. And I think that the temple is the basic charge, because look down in, well, he really picks up the tabernacle way back starting in 37, starts dealing with the wandering in the wilderness. And we've got the passage in 38 of the so-called church in the wilderness. And when you get into 44, you've got the tabernacle again in the wilderness, and then you've got them finally brought into the promised land, verse 45. And so you know the Old Testament story. Once they're there, David says, well, you know, here I am living in my house, and God has lived behind curtains all of his life and tabernacle, so I'll do something. And God said no, but Solomon, verse 47, would build him a house. And then here's what Stephen does. He quotes them their own Old Testament to show them that God had something higher in mind than a literal building of four walls. Howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands, as saith the prophet Isaiah. Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will ye build me, saith the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? Hath not my hand made all these things? Now that's the end of the sermon, and here's the application of it. Ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, ye do always resist the Holy Spirit, as your fathers did, so do ye. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? They've slain them which showed before the coming of the just one. And of course they slew the just one as well, of whom ye have been now the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. And when they heard these things, they were cut to the heart, and they gnashed on him with their teeth, really at him. They didn't get to him and chew him up like a pork chop. But he, being full of the Holy Spirit, looked up steadfastly into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing on the right hand of God, and said, Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. And they cried out with a loud voice, and stopped their ears, and ran upon him with one accord, and cast him out of the city, and stoned him. Well, let me just give you a little more information of how things really become interesting here. The Hellenistic Jews, and this is why we put so much study into the background of this issue. The Hellenistic Jews, and now Hellenistic Jewish Christians, because of their contact with the Gentile world out there. Now, they didn't pick up the false views of morality or the pantheons of the gods or something. But because of their contact, they are much broader, much more forward in their beliefs, much more zealous, much more radical. They were raised with Jewish tradition. Don't misunderstand me, but they were raised in an environment that served to temper that Jewish upbringing. That the law is right. That's true. You have to be very careful in what you say and how you interpret this, but by virtue of the fact they lived in the Gentile world out there, they saw all the other options that were around. Not that they believe the options, but there are other options around. If you're raised in some cloistered home in Jerusalem, you're raised with the law and nothing but the law. You don't even know anything else but that. And so you're not open Your mind is not open or receptive to maybe Jesus being the fulfillment of the Old Testament law because it doesn't exactly fit the way the rabbis were teaching or the way the Jewish leaders were recognizing it to. See, most people in Israel didn't respond to him. Paul and all these people get thrown out of Israel. They end up having to make their converts outside of Israel. And I'm trying to explain why. The people out there, the Jews, are much broader, more tolerant, more forward in their thinking and practice. In other words, they appear much more eager and ready to denounce dead Jewish ritual and false rabbinical interpretation than are the Jews that are raised and born with that in Palestine. In other words, they are much more ready to carry their Christianity to what they feel are the obvious conclusions. The obvious conclusions are a break with Judaism. The obvious conclusions are no more going to the temple at the Jewish hour of prayer, because God doesn't dwell in temples made with men's hands. Remember, Peter and John kept going to the temple, didn't they? Nothing wrong with that, but eventually you have to stop doing that. Eventually you have to let the people know Christianity is not Jewish. It is an entirely different movement. You can't be Jewish and think that you're going to be accepted in the eyes of God, not post-Calvary. You have to make a break with that. And the apostles are not willing to do that. It took a vision, and see, we're early for this, way over in chapter 10, repeated 3 times before Peter got the message. And then Peter goes and fellowships with Cornelius and then has all types of problems when he gets back to Jerusalem, remember. And then, think of it like this. Does Peter stay consistent with his new... No, Galatians 2. Galatians 2 comes after that. He falls right back into that geographical, national bias of his to fellowship only with the Jewish people. Stay away from the Gentile people. Now, this means that naturally, neither the men of the synagogue, who are Hellenists, but who are not Christians, they'd be more open perhaps to receive than others, but neither the men of the synagogue or the Sanhedrin, made up of Hebraists or true Hebrews, are willing to receive God's message. But I think what we have on our hands here, with the introduction of this new group of people, the Hellenists, God begins to use people like Stephen and later Philip to do what the apostles apparently were unwilling to do. Now, they were bold. I don't mean to say that the apostles weren't bold, but I don't think I'm reading anything into the text here. I think that there is a pointed reason for Luke drawing out the problem, then giving us 2 chapters on Stephen, giving us 1 chapter, and they're all consecutive. 1 chapter on Philip, Acts 8, and then lo and behold, boom, we're to the conversion of Saul, another Hellenist by birth and by language, in chapter 9. And then you've got chapter 10 after that, which would have to come after the events that we have here in chapters 6, 7, and 8. I mean, let's reverse the situation. Let's assume that maybe Stephen or Philip had been given that vision that Peter got over in Acts 10. Do you think they would have been as hesitant to do it? Surely not. What do they have to lose? We are already looked down upon by the Jewish people to begin with, even though we're Jews. We are already looked down upon. Peter had everything to lose to contact Cornelius and his household in Caesarea by the sea. Now, I think that's it. This is the exciting new thing. Now, we can't interpret this to mean that, if we bring it right down to today into our church, that, well, now what we really need are some people that are influenced by the world out there because you're more forward-thinking and so forth. No, because you're into neo-evangelicalism then. But I do think that there's an application in this sense, that the only way God was able to reach some of us in the church, you see, we were brought up as, quote, Hebraists in the church, was somehow some of us had a more forward attitude to all of this. We were a little broader in our thinking, willing to be, let's say, more tolerant and broader in our thinking. And that's why we received the Holy Spirit and a whole lot of other people didn't. And why God is able to use those who are more forward, not unbiblical. You can't go beyond the teaching of Scripture. but who are more forward, more radical, more, as I said earlier, ready to carry their Christianity to its necessary and logical conclusions. And Stephen, of course, becomes so important. He has been immortalized as the first Christian martyr. As far as we know, the first Christian martyr was someone born out in Gentile territory. I think we again have a hint here in Luke's account of the fact that the church is going to spread. It's going to spread according to Acts 1:8, and it's going to spread whether the apostles do anything about it or not. Now, the commission was given to them in Acts 1:8. You're going to receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses. And we see them up in Samaria in Acts 8 and other places. But it was not only given to them, but to the church through them. In chapter 8, who do we pick up here? Stephen has passed off the scene, but here we pick up Philip. The church is scattered, however, in the first 4 verses. That time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Now, I think that there's probably a better way to understand this passage than taking the word all in its literal sense, that the entire church was scattered. Whom do you suppose was scattered in Acts 8, verses 1 to 4? The Hellenistic Jewish Christians are the ones scattered. They are the ones that are causing too many problems here in Jerusalem. They are the ones that the Jewish authorities are after, because they're willing to break prayer times, break liturgy, break sacrifice, break any adherence to the temple, make a full break between Christianity and Judaism. And the Hebrews, which include the apostles, are not ready to do that. And it not surprisingly then takes a Hellenist, Philip, to be the first one to go to Samaria. And I think that since his story immediately follows the scattering of the church, then that's what proves that the Christians who were scattered were Hellenists and not the Hebrew Jewish Christians. See, if it says the whole church was scattered, and you read about the death of Stephen, and then verse 4, you read it again, the church is scattered, they went everywhere preaching the word, and then here's an example of going everywhere preaching the word. Then Philip, well, we're back to one of those men from that Hellenistic group now. Now, we know that the apostles come down later and pray for the people to receive the Holy Spirit, and that's probably for some other reasons, but still Philip is the one who takes the message out. And then that will leave us with, for next week, jumping into chapter 9, and then making perhaps even some more connections here as to this man Saul. And I have some very interesting things I want to say about him. Some of that you can probably construe already in your own mind, but maybe there's one particular thing that you can't. But have you followed me thus far? Amen. I think that he's telling us something very important here in these chapters. A whole shift is taking place in the church and its whole constitution now, and its makeup. That these Hellenistic Jews, you see, that's why I wanted to argue earlier, several months ago, that they're not unorthodox in their theology, but they've been touched by the Gentile world out there. And touched in just such a way it makes them tolerant, or let's say open enough, to hearing an interpretation of the Old Testament not according to current rabbinical interpretation. And that interpretation is Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of all of these prophecies. They're just broad-minded enough to be open to hearing that. And as a result, they are going to be the ones through whom God works to scatter the message all out into the world. It's rare when you see the apostles out there. You see Peter up in Antioch, but you don't have any other proof in the New Testament for any of the apostles being anywhere else. Now, there are a lot of legends and traditions that perhaps have some truth to them, that Thomas went here and that James, well, he ends up dead, that John went there. We see John way later, but he's writing books and epistles, and we've lost the Jewish connection by the time we get to that. But Peter went to Rome. You don't have any suggestion in the book of Acts that any of this is true. You've got Paul going everywhere, but Paul's an apostle of a different order. He comes from a Hellenistic background. You've got Philip going other places, and surely Stephen would have gone as well had he not been killed to begin with. The first Christian martyr is a broad-minded Hellenistic Jew, one that was willing to do something that the church in general was not willing to do, that the apostles were not willing to do. And so if you want an application from it, the application is what I've already been saying, that we need to be broad-minded enough to get right interpretations out of the Word of God that are not in vogue with current theology. Those are the only people that God can reach and really use. The rest of the people just kind of remain stagnant. They're not fulfilling God's greater purpose. They might be fulfilling part of His purpose, but they're not fulfilling the complete purpose of God or the greater purpose of God. They've stopped at a means instead of carrying a means to an end and really doing something about their Christianity. That would be the application that I would see here. Those are the type of people that God chose to use in the early church. Broad-minded people, radical people. I mean, no one could question the fact that Stephen and Philip were two radical young men in the church. Call Stephen his life. Philip was one of those scattered from Jerusalem, Acts 8, 1, 4, and then verse 5. No one could question these men are radical. And as a result, God uses them. He couldn't use the people. We don't know how long it's been, but we're told in those days, Acts 6:1. It's been some time after Pentecost. God can't continue to use these people if they're going to keep going up to the temple at the Jewish hour of prayer and say, well, we're Christians, but we're going to keep celebrating, all the Jewishness at the same time and not see any distinctions. Now, Paul would go back and try to identify with things, but Paul had evangelistic reasons for wanting to be in Jerusalem at Pentecost and so forth. And Paul has a broader mind. I think these people are brought up like Peter, and I'm not intending to be critical in any way that the Scriptures do not speak, but you tend to kind of become stale and stagnant. That, well, we're Jews, we're Christians now, and we're not doing anything about it. Notice God said that you're to witness in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost part of They're not ever doing that. They haven't gone about to do it at all. Surely God has His timing, but God also has His way. And He chose to use someone who would be effective out there. I don't know that Peter would have been, and the other apostles, that effective in reaching these people. That is, those people, the Jewish people out in the Hellenistic world. But you take a radical, broad-minded, forward-thinking person like Stephen or Philip or the rest of the group of these Hellenistic Jewish Christians. These are Christians of a different order. So people that say, like the old denominational folk of our day, well, now back in the first century there was just one group of Christians. Well, there were different groups then. People more and less radical. There have always been. The Old Testament narratives say that that's true. People more and less radical. People more ready to carry their beliefs to obvious, logical, necessary conclusions. Stephen, with the wisdom that God had given the man, saw Christianity to its end. If what we're teaching and believing is true, then that means the abolition of the temple. Peter and them hadn't grasped that thought yet. He saw that. If what Isaiah said is true, then he began to interpret things dispensationally. Then the temple has a time and a place, but its time is going to come to an end. And he didn't wait for AD 70 for that time to be. Time is now. What do you think if the accusations against them were, these men are speaking something, now they were called false witnesses because they were misinterpreting what they were saying, but these men are speaking against the temple and against the law of Moses. There had to be something in Stephen's message that was directed in that area for you to misconstrue. You have to have some basis to misinterpret or misconstrue it. And so, we put words in Stephen's mouth, but he was preaching some type of sermon about, listen folks, the temple is not where it's at. Temple is not where it's at. Now, he doesn't come right out maybe and say something, but that's where he's headed. That's the direction in which he's headed. And by the time he gets into chapter 7, he might as well pull all plugs and shoot him with both barrels. It means his life before Sanhedrin here, so we're just going to tell you like it is. You are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. And as your fathers resisted the Holy Spirit, they were not willing to be led by Him, maybe a new area or a new direction, so are you unwilling to listen to the Holy Spirit. See, they could claim, but we are listening because the Word, the Old Testament, teaches the temple and liturgy. But you have to know more than that. There were proof texts in Isaiah, but you had to have the Spirit's help in interpreting them. When are those applicable? Why would God have ever allowed the temple to be built if what Isaiah said is true, that God doesn't dwell in temples made with men's hands? But there was a time for the temple, and there comes a time for the end of the temple. And you see, Jesus, he doesn't come right up and speak about all those things. There's a time to speak about that. You would have alienated everyone. He continues going to the temple, teaching in the temple. He's not offering sacrifice for his own sins, but he's a part, because he doesn't have any. He's a part of what's going on there. And the early church stays a part of that. And it takes a while to get these young men, this group of Hellenistai, the Hellenists in. And these guys are just going to break from all of this. We're just not going to go to the temple anymore. And why can't we stay at home and pray to God? God doesn't dwell in that temple over there anyway. And they're right. And Peter and them kind of knew that they're right, but that's a bold step to take when the temple has been there for over 1,000 years. And you're just going to say, end? It's the end of the temple? The end of that era? That's a hard thing for a Jew to see, including a Christian Jew, and especially if he's born in Palestine. It takes one born somewhere else, influenced by the fact that there are other alternatives than the typical Jewish way of life. Although they stayed with that out there in the diaspora, there are other alternatives.